Today we're going to remove, clean, and reinstall the Generac GP5500 Carburetor. Before we actually remove the carburetor, let's make sure a couple quick checks that are done before you start tearing it apart. The first one is make sure that the switch is in the on position. There's a switch and a fuel valve and the choke, and sometimes people forget that it has this switch over here. So make sure it's in the on position. Make sure that the oil is coming up right about to where it's coming out. Definitely got to be on the threads. The little marker in here is not very good. Mine will run, or will not run, even with the oil in the zone. So basically make sure this is almost as full as you can get it. Otherwise the automatic cutoff will prevent it from starting. For sort of advanced troubleshooting, make sure that this wire that goes over to the carburetor, that it's a continuous loop. It's some sort of induction system, and if this disconnects right here, which we'll do later when we take it off, if that's disconnected, the circuit won't work. And then lastly is make sure you have the valve in the correct position. In my case, the horizontal position is off and either vertical position is on. If all these things are in place, the generator should start pretty easily. Might need to pull choke there a little bit. In my experience, the Generac starts on the first, second, or third pull. The only reason it wouldn't start here is because I forgot to put the choke on. If you're pulling the pull cord more than 3 or 4 times, you've probably got a problem that you need to address. Okay, somehow I lost one of my segments, so I'm going to come back and show you the next step. With the faceplate off, we're going to take the foam out. We're going to take an 8mm socket and remove those 6 pieces and pull this plastic piece off. And then you'll see that there are 2 10mm bolts nuts here and then one on the back side. And what we're looking to do is take this whole assembly off. As you pull it up, you can pull the assembly off. There's the bolts that hold the assembly right there. You take it off. Be careful not to pull this. If you follow it back, it goes into an aluminum housing here, and this tube can be pulled loose. It's just pressure connected. There's no grommet or anything. That leaves us with the bracket that holds the choke lever. If you watch right here, you can see when you move the choke, it moves this little flapper valve right here. When you have the choke full on, it's closed off, and there's a hole here that allows about 25% of the surface, so a little bit less air. So when you're doing your troubleshooting and you're trying to get with carburetor cleaner, if you've got the choke full on, that may restrict how much carburetor cleaner gets in there. There's a little gasket here, so be careful as you take this off not to damage that gasket. And so this little bracket here I'm going to take off. It also, if you look right here, there's a black cap, and there's a little metal rod that goes down into it. It doesn't have any kind of connection. It's just sitting, it's just a pin that goes through a little hole that's on this black cap. So as you bring it out, you're going to have to release this rubber hose that goes back. There's a grommet on the back side, a rubber grommet. You can sort of just push it down with your finger, and then be aware of this little metal thing. You don't want to jerk it and break this black regulator, which controls the throttle flapper valve there. I don't know what the technical term is, but so as I come out, sliding it off the front of these two nuts, and then I'm lifting sort of up until this metal thing comes clear, and just removing it and setting it off to the side. So you take this spring off, you rotate the throttle arm or whatever they call it, and then you lift up. It will only come out when this thing is rotated all the way over to the side. And then once this is out, just kind of tuck it off to the side there a little bit. And you can see it comes off. The only problem is I forgot to release the cable, so I'm going to sort of hang it there for a moment. The cable is attached with two little plastic, I don't know what you call them, retainers. Not very hard to remove. They're just little wedges that go into those holes. And then lastly, here we have to break this circuit. So when you pull this, be gentle, but when you pull it apart, you can take it out. And now you have the cable, the fuel line's disconnected, the throttle controller, whatever you want to call it, is disconnected. I can pull this off. There's also a gasket on this side, so be very careful not to damage it. And then I'm going to put the whole assembly over into my nice clean storage bin and come back over here and do just the once off with carburetor cleaner. Make sure there's no grit. So this tube here, you can see, goes back into this aluminum housing. It's just a pressure fit, so be careful. If you pull it off, no big deal. All you got to do is stick it back in, but you have to squeeze it to get it to go in the holes, and then it will expand back out. Okay, so I've laid out the stuff. We took off the foam and the outer cap, got all the nuts loose, took off the outer case, removed this once we had the nuts removed, took those 10mm bolts, nuts here, and then the one that was on the back side, got this black case off, and then we dismounted the choke valves. Alright, so I got over on my workbench. I got the carburetor in my plastic tray here, and we're going to disassemble it and reassemble it. Okay, a couple of safety considerations. Make sure you're wearing eye protection, and I recommend you wear a glove or something for the carburetor cleaner stuff. This was that throttle valve that we talked about, that the pin goes in from the choke mechanism, and you can see here how when it's in the choke mode, there's a hole in it that allows a reduced amount of airflow into the carburetor. So the actual disassembly is pretty straightforward. This has already been broken free from yesterday when I cleaned it up originally. So these two screws, you may take some decent amount of torque on them to break them loose, depending on how old or corroded they are. When you take it out, this assembly, I would be careful. I'm not sure, what's going on in there. There's some type of magnetic, there's some sort of spring. Now yesterday this was completely gummed up and gooped up. So I took some carburetor cleaner and my little wire brush, and I also have a toothbrush, and just sort of cleaned it up and make sure that it floats more or less freely and it springs back into position. Set that aside. Again, be careful not to damage the the gasket here so you can reuse it. I'm going to start with a 14 millimeter socket. Okay, righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. Now this is pretty snug the first time you do it. Again, this was cleaned yesterday, so everything comes apart fairly nicely, but when you first break it loose, it took a fair amount of torque to get that thing to break loose. When you look at this, you're going to see some holes on the side. There's one hole there's a little rubber O-ring right there. Right above it's a hole, and then just between the thread there's like a step down, and there's threads. There's another hole, and then there's the hole that goes all the way through. So yesterday this was completely covered in brown goop, and you know, obviously all these ports and injectors or not injectors, but weep holes. You couldn't even see them barely. So there's like 4 ports on this thing. So when you clean it, use a brush and make sure that you can look and see through it. This isn't brain surgery. It doesn't have to be perfect, but when you look from one side of the weep hole to the other side, you should be able to see through it. And when you look through the end, you should be able to see through it. So it was pretty straightforward. It was basically inject. Now I'm going to try and illustrate here. When I shoot through, it goes through all the way through. So again, just lightly wire brush this. It's probably a good idea to take this O-ring off. Just put your thumbnail in there and gently slide it off the end. That way when you are using the wire brush on it, you won't damage the O-ring. Nothing fancy, just get the corrosion off. Make sure that you can get carb cleaner through it, set it aside, or reassemble the O-ring so it doesn't get lost. Okay. I'm going to set that aside. Now the bowl comes down. This had a bunch of goo in it. Basically I just sprayed it out, and I used my toothbrush, which is a little softer, and just cleaned it up. It doesn't, again, it's not brain surgery, it doesn't have to be perfect, but check down here, make sure this is cleared out. Generally clean and serviceable. Okay, the float here has a needle valve and a hinge. The hinge is just a pin. It pulls out. Gently pull the float valve out here. Notice that it's got a little needle thing here, needle valve. If you look here, you'll see that there's a more rounded area. You can just slide this in to the center and bring the needle out. Now keep in mind there's a little spring right here that keeps this thing taut, so don't lose that spring. This really just is about a little bit of cleanup, maybe a toothbrush or a wire brush to keep it clean. When it comes time, make sure that the spring is on that needle valve. Come to that center rounded opening, push it up and slide it over. Okay? And then sort of set it off to the side. We'll put it back in a moment. If you take a flathead screwdriver in, you'll see inside there's basically a self-threading nut of some sort. I don't know what they call it. Now, it's a little stiff the first time. This was cleaned yesterday, so this one's a little stiff, or a little bit easier to get out. And to give you some idea, yesterday I didn't even clean this. This piece didn't even come out, and I cleaned everything else up, and the motor ran. But if you look at this little valve thing, there's a bunch of weep holes in the side here, so make sure you lightly clean off the corrosion. You should be able to inject fluid down the length of it, and also you should be able to see, after you clean it, looking through the weep holes, you should be able to see all the way through to the far side. Put that off to the side. Same thing with this little threaded nut here. Clean it, especially make sure that you can get carburetor cleaner through it, because that's where the fuel is going to come in here and then down, eventually comes down this shaft, and these pieces are in there, so it's got to be able to come all the way through. There's an O-ring right here, so be careful not to damage it, but generally clean up the area here. I took my little bore brush here, my 22 caliber bore brush, and just gently cleaned out these guys right here, these holes, and then flushed them with carb cleaner. When you look at the front of the air intake here, there's a little weep hole right here. If you blow carburetor cleaner through it, it should come down the center pipe there. So you want to make sure that's clean. What else? That's the main thing. So just generally make sure that all the goo and the gunk is off of these internal parts. Again, be careful not to damage this gasket as you do it. Set that back aside. We've cleaned the bowl out. Pretty much got everything cleaned up. So here's all my parts down here, and they're all more or less ready to go. So the first thing I'm going to do is put this stem valve right back in there, put that little threaded piece in there and snug that down. You know, it's going to the engine's going to vibrate, so make sure it's snug, but you don't want to torque it so tight that you can't get the thing out. Okay, now that that's snugged in, I'm going to take my float valve there with that needle valve floater, set it in there, and then thread this pin back in so that it floats like that. And it's hard to see, but you can see that that needle valve is back in that hole. Now I'm going to hold the assembly. So this is in the upright position. Here's the choke. This goes off to that throttle arm, and this is the part that mounts to the engine block. So this thread, this drain sump screw, was approximately in this position right here. I can't see any specific markings to align it, so as you disassemble it, it's a good idea to kind of maybe put a mark or just generally get the right orientation. But it seems to work okay. I gently seat that back, and with that O-ring right there, I'm going to put this back on. Okay. And use my 14mm socket. Tighten that down. Righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. I'm going to tighten it, but not to the point where I crack it, you know. Nice and snug, but not too tight. I'm going to put this assembly back in. Now, I'm going to put it so that this is going out the same direction, the cable is going out the same direction as the fuel tube. There's a little shoulder on this that fits in this rubber grommet, so get it in there, seat it nicely, and then stick the screws back in. Use a Phillips screwdriver. Again, snug, but not to the point that it's going to strip anything. Remember, this engine's going to be running for a long period of time, so it'll vibrate, so you want things to be reasonably snug. If you look here, you'll see there is a little like lock washer on that thing. So at this point, it's more or less ready for reinstallation. Now, before we reinstall it, if you look at this pan, you'll see a lot of grime in it. This is what was in this carburetor yesterday when I cleaned it out. This is the residue from that cleaning job. So you can see there was a lot of junk in there. Now we're going to reassemble this. We're going to put the carburetor on, put the choke valve controller on, and then reassemble the other pieces. So I'm going to start with the 10mm connections. First of all, I'm going to lightly or gently put these back on, move that little throttle arm out of the way. Make sure it fits snugly there. Okay. Then I'm going to move this throttle arm holder here to its full rotated position. Put it down. It'll naturally spring that way. Then you put this spring here back in place. Kind of bend that hook so that it holds it snug in place. Okay. Once we get that in position, you can do this in any number of places, but it's probably as good as any is to put the fuel line back on it. Adjust that clamp there. Kind of keep it snugged up out of the way. I'm going to run the cable. I'm going to put the little brackets back in their holes here, and then over on the other mount, and we'll hook this up in a moment. Okay, another segment I somehow lost. Before I put the black filter assembly on, after I put the carburetor back on, we want to install that choke assembly. And there's two things that are really important about this as you slide this assembly back in. If you look at how to take it off, just reverse the process. But make sure that this hose, that the rubber grommet is pushed up in here, and it acts as an anchor for that hose that's coming in here. And then remember the little black cap here that has the lever arm on it. There's a pin in this silver assembly that drops down in there. So as you insert this piece back onto the carburetor mounts, make sure that you put the hose and the pin back in the correct place. Now this is pretty important, because otherwise you'll be wasting your time when you reassemble. Right here, this black cap, when you need to rotate it so that the arm on it is forward when the choke is out and that the pin is down. Then you can see it's still loose, but then when I move this, when I push this lever back, it pulls the arm back, which changes the position of the valve here, the flutter valve. So now I'm going to push it all the way back like that. I'm going to put my housing back in place. Snug it down. Pull this up out of the way. pull the hose down just far enough so that it's out of the way of this action. So now when I move the choke, you can see that it's changing the position of the flutter valve. So you got to make sure that works before you go any further. Then I'm going to put that backside 10mm bolt or nut down here on the back to keep this black housing secured, and then we're going to put the other portion, the filter portion, on. Alright, so this is now snug. The line is connected, the fuel is connected, the arm's connected. So now I'm going to put the black plastic in, put those 6 nuts. Okay, with the 6 nuts back, I'm going to put my filter back in, my foam. Make sure you get the top up. There's a opening on the bottom there. Now, last but not least, kind of goes back to our earlier checks. You got to get this circuit otherwise it won't work. Now, once that circuit's complete, you should be able to put it in the on position. Make sure the fuel is on. Probably make sure the choke is on. And like I say, if you're pulling more than about 3 or 4 times on one of these Generacs, you're wasting your time. Start looking for the problem. Hope this helps.